He raised it, fed it, swam with it, called it his son. But on one horrifying day in South Africa, the very creature he trusted above all others, a 1-ton hippo named Humphrey, turned on him. What followed was a savage attack so brutal it shocked the world and proved once and for all, a wild animal is never truly tame. South Africa, 2011. On a sprawling farm in the Free State, one man lived with a companion unlike any other. His name was Marius Els, a former army major and farmer. His pet? Not a dog, not a horse, but a hippopotamus, the most dangerous large mammal in Africa. The hippo, named Humphrey, weighed over a ton, with jaws strong enough to crush bone. Yet Marius treated him like family. He built him a pond, fed him daily, even swam alongside him in the river. To friends and neighbors, the bond seemed insane. A man embracing the very animal most feared on the continent. Locals warned him, hippos kill more people in Africa than lions, crocodiles, and elephants combined. They are unpredictable, territorial, and armed with massive tusks. But Marius brushed the warnings aside. He saw not a beast, but a son. "Humphrey's like a child to me," he once said proudly. But beneath the calm surface of this strange companionship, danger was always lurking, and soon it would erupt with fatal force. To outsiders, Humphrey was not a pet. He was a ticking time bomb. Neighbors spoke in whispers about the enormous animal roaming the property. Visitors watched with unease as the hippo followed Marius like a shadow, its hulking body lumbering through fields, its yawns revealing fangs longer than a man's forearm. Wildlife experts were blunt. A hippo can never be tamed. No matter how gentle it looks, it is wild. They reminded Marius that hippos kill hundreds every year, overturning boats and mauling fishermen to pieces. They told him one charge from Humphrey could snap his spine. But Marius refused to see danger. To him, Humphrey wasn't just an animal. He was family. He fed him by hand, kissed his broad snout, even let children ride on the creature's back. He insisted that Humphrey trusted him, loved him. The community shook their heads, because they knew a truth Marius didn't want to face. With wild power comes wild instinct, and instinct never sleeps. At first, Humphrey seemed like the perfect companion. He followed Marius through the river like an obedient dog, and the two shared countless afternoons drifting side by side under the South African sun. But then, the cracks began to show. Locals saw Humphrey blocking Marius's path, standing rigid, ears twitching, eyes wide with something darker. Territorial dominance. The giant hippo would open its jaws in a mock yawn, displaying tusks meant to warn, not welcome. Marius laughed it off. He told neighbors it was just play, that Humphrey meant no harm. But the unease in the air was real. A 6-foot, 2,500-pound animal does not play. There were stories, too, unconfirmed but whispered, that Humphrey had once chased people away from the riverbank, even cornering them in boats. His instincts were surfacing, sharp and primal, like the river itself was reminding everyone, this is no pet. This is a predator. Marius ignored the warnings. He only saw the bond. But in nature, bonds are fragile, and when they break, the consequences are fatal. November 2011. The air was heavy, the Limpopo River sluggish under the heat of the South African sun. Marius Els stepped outside his farmhouse, eyes fixed on the enclosure where Humphrey lingered. To him, it wasn't just another day. It was another chance to prove to the world that the critics were wrong, that his pet hippo wasn't a monster. Neighbors later said he looked calm, even proud, as he walked toward the enclosure, bucket in hand. But there was tension hanging in the air. Humphrey wasn't grazing lazily that morning. He was restless, his massive bulk pacing along the river's edge, jaws snapping, nostrils flaring. Marius didn't flinch. He'd swum with Humphrey before, ridden on his back, laughed in the face of fear. Why would today be any different? What Marius didn't see, or maybe refused to see, was the change in the hippo's body language, the shift from curiosity to aggression, the moment when instinct overrides years of familiarity. As he stepped closer, the enclosure fell silent, like it was holding its breath. And then, Humphrey moved. The line between companion and killer was about to be shattered forever. It happened in a flash. Humphrey lunged. 2 tons of raw muscle and rage burst from the riverbank, jaws yawning wider than a man's shoulders, tusks like daggers glinting in the sun. The sound wasn't just a splash, the ground shaking as hooves tore through dirt and mud. Marius had no time to run, no time to think. The hippo clamped down on him with crushing force. Witnesses later said it was as if a tree trunk had snapped in half. Marius's screams echoed across the farm, mingling with the guttural roars of the beast as it tossed him violently along the bank. Dust and blood filled the air. Humphrey shook him like prey, tossing him as though he weighed nothing. Each strike of those tusks tore deeper, breaking bones, ripping flesh. This wasn't the playful companion Marius had shown to reporters. This was the wild, uncontainable monster his neighbors had warned about all along. The man who once swam with the gentle giant was now being mauled to death by it, and no one could stop it. Humphrey dragged Marius into the river. The surface boiled with violence, water turning red as the hippo thrashed him beneath the waves. Marius fought, clawing at the beast, gasping for air whenever his head broke the surface. But each time, Humphrey's jaws came down again, driving him deeper. Neighbors rushed toward the riverbank, shouting, helpless. They could only watch as the man who had once ridden this hippo like a horse was now being ripped apart. The water churned with chaos. Mud, blood, and bubbles rose in a sickening swirl. Marius's body was slammed against rocks, dragged into the current, crushed again and again by tusks powerful enough to snap a canoe in half. And then, silence. The water stilled. The ripples faded. Humphrey surfaced alone, his massive head slick with red, glaring at the shore. Marius Els was gone. The bond he believed unbreakable had ended in the most violent betrayal imaginable. When the chaos subsided, neighbors hesitated to approach. The riverbank was eerily quiet, except for Humphrey, still lurking in the shallows, his massive frame blocking any attempt at rescue. Hours later, when the hippo finally moved on, they found him. Marius's body lay twisted and broken in the reeds. His chest was crushed, his limbs torn, deep puncture wounds gaping where Humphrey's tusks had struck. Blood soaked into the mud around him, staining the water where he had once played so fearlessly with the animal he called family. The sight stunned everyone into silence. This wasn't a hunter mauled by a wild beast. This was a man torn apart by the very creature he loved most. Those who had warned him, who had said, "A hippo is never a pet," now stood frozen in horror. Their fears had been realized in the most brutal way possible. The bond between man and beast had ended not in companionship, but in carnage. News spread like wildfire. A man had been killed, not by a crocodile or a lion, but by his own pet hippo. Neighbors who had once marveled at the sight of Marius riding Humphrey through the water now spoke in hushed, haunted tones. To them, it had always seemed impossible. A hippo was a killer of legend, Africa's most feared animal. Yet Marius had insisted his bond was different. The town reeled with grief, but also disbelief. How could a man so experienced with animals have trusted one so deadly? And yet, deep down, many admitted they weren't surprised. They remembered the warnings, the uneasy looks, the whispered words. One day, Humphrey will turn. That day had come, and the brutal proof was splashed across headlines, shocking not just a community, but the world. Within hours, the story was everywhere. Man killed by his pet hippo. The headline alone was enough to freeze readers in disbelief. Around the globe, news outlets painted Marius Els as both a daredevil and a tragic fool, someone who believed love could tame one of the most dangerous creatures on Earth. Clips of him swimming alongside Humphrey played on repeat, smiling, laughing, calling the animal his child. Juxtaposed against grisly details of his death, the contrast was almost unbearable to watch. The hippo was no longer seen as a quirky pet, it was a monster. And Marius's name became a cautionary tale. People debated endlessly. Was he reckless, or was this simply the ultimate price for ignoring the line between wild and tame? In living rooms, on talk shows, in headlines across continents, Marius Els was everywhere. Not as the man who loved animals, but as the man who was killed by one. Long before the attack, the warnings were everywhere. Locals shook their heads when they saw Marius ride Humphrey through the shallows, as if the hippo were a horse. Wildlife experts reminded anyone who would listen. Hippos kill more people in Africa than lions, leopards, elephants, and rhinos combined. But Marius didn't see a killer. He saw a companion. He brushed off the danger with a smile, telling reporters, "There's a bond between Humphrey and me. I trust him completely." Yet the truth was written in the hippo's DNA. Hippos are unpredictable, territorial, and capable of killing with a single bite. To love one is to court disaster. On that day in 2011, every warning crystallized into brutal reality. The experts were right, the neighbors were right, and the man who thought he had defied nature paid the ultimate price. The news of Marius Els' death spread like wildfire. Headlines screamed of the man killed by his own pet hippo. Locals who had once marveled at the sight of Humphrey swimming alongside his owner now spoke in hushed tones, shaking their heads. They had warned him. Everyone had warned him. Wildlife officials descended on the farm, forced to confront the grim reality. A hippo that had been treated like family had revealed its true nature. The creature that Marius once kissed on the snout had mauled him to death, dragging him into the river as if he were nothing. For many, it wasn't just a tragedy, it was proof. Proof that no matter how much love or care a human gives, some animals can never be tamed. Humphrey was not a pet, he was a predator, and now he had blood on his jaws to prove it. The community mourned Marius, but they also whispered a chilling truth. He had always believed he was different, that his bond was stronger. But in the end, nature had the final word. Marius Els believed love could tame nature's most dangerous beast. He believed trust could outweigh instinct. But Humphrey the hippo gave the world a brutal reminder. Wild is wild. No matter the years spent together, no matter the bond, instinct can erupt in a split second. Lethal. Unstoppable. Marius once called Humphrey his child. In the end, that child crushed him with jaws that can snap a canoe in half, dragged him into the murky river, and silenced his life in seconds. His death is not just a tragedy. It's a warning carved in blood. Some animals may look docile, even affectionate, but beneath the surface lies raw, ancient power. A power that doesn't forgive mistakes. And so, Marius Els' story closes as one of the most haunting lessons of all. You can never take the wild out of the wild. Marius Els thought he had found a bond stronger than fear itself. But Humphrey the hippo proved, with brutal finality, that nature always has the last word. If this story shook you, don't leave just yet. Because the next video takes us even deeper into another chilling true encounter you won't believe. Make sure you hit subscribe, tap the notification bell, and join us as we uncover more real stories where the line between trust and terror is shattered in an instant. Marius Els thought his pet hippo was tame, until it turned and killed him. In a chillingly similar twist, Paul Macdonald was slain by his own deer, both men victims of the wild creatures they tried to call pets. This is his story. A quiet Australian farm, a man feeding the pet deer he had raised like family. But in seconds, trust turned to terror. The stag lowered its antlers and gored him in his own yard. As his wife screamed and tried to save him, the animal turned on her too. This is the shocking final story of Paul Macdonald, a man killed not by a stranger, but by the pet he thought he knew. The air was calm over the Macdonald family's property in rural Victoria, Australia. Morning sunlight stretched across the paddocks. Paul Macdonald walked out to the deer enclosure like he had done countless times before. Inside was the stag he had raised for 2 years. A powerful animal he treated less like livestock and more like a trusted companion. But this morning, something was different. It was rutting season. The deer's hormones surged, instincts sharpened, and in the blink of an eye, it snapped. The stag lowered its head. Antlers like sharpened spears caught the light. And then, it charged. Neighbors would later recall the screams that pierced the stillness of the countryside. Paul's wife, Mandy, ran to the enclosure as fast as she could. What she saw was a nightmare. Her husband pinned, the stag's antlers driving into him again and again. She rushed in to save him, and the animal turned on her too, thrashing her to the ground. A frantic emergency call was placed. "The deer's got him! He's down!" But by the time help arrived, the damage was already irreversible. Paul Macdonald lay fatally wounded in the yard he had tended for years. killed by the very creature he thought he could trust. Paul Macdonald was no stranger to animals. At 47 years old, he lived a quiet life on his rural property in Victoria, Australia. A man who loved the outdoors, hard work, and the bond between humans and creatures. To most, deer were wild animals best admired from a distance. But for Paul, one stag was different. He had raised it from a young age, feeding it, sheltering it, and watching it grow into a massive, imposing beast. Over time, Paul treated the animal not just as livestock, but as a trusted pet, even a symbol of the simple, grounded life he wanted for his family. The stag, towering 6 feet tall and weighing hundreds of pounds, was undeniably beautiful. Its antlers branched like a crown, a striking, majestic figure in the morning mist of the paddock. Neighbors often saw Paul tending to it, unafraid, confident, believing the trust between man and animal could outweigh instinct. But that trust was built on fragile ground. Experts would later explain, a stag is never truly tame. Even after years of familiarity, one trigger could unleash its raw, primal side. And in spring, the most dangerous season of all, testosterone surged through the deer's body, sharpening aggression and fueling dominance. Paul wasn't naive. He knew the rutting season made stags unpredictable, but he believed he could handle it. After all, he had done so for 2 years without a single incident. To him, this wasn't a wild animal waiting to turn. It was his deer. That belief, that dangerous assumption of trust, set the stage for tragedy. When Paul stepped into the enclosure on April 17, 2019, he walked in as a caretaker. But in the stag's eyes, he had just stepped into a battlefield. April 17, 2019. A cool, ordinary morning in Glenrowan West, Victoria. Paul Macdonald rose as he always did, quietly, methodically, with the rhythm of rural life. His wife, Mandy, prepared for the day while he pulled on his boots, ready to feed the animals before breakfast. To anyone else, stepping into a deer enclosure would be an unthinkable risk. But for Paul, it was routine. He carried the feed, walked across the paddock, and unlatched the gate with the same easy confidence he had countless times before. The deer paced inside, muscles taut beneath its coat, its antlers catching the light like blades. Paul thought nothing of it. He had raised this animal, nurtured it, and believed in their bond. But this was the rutting season. Testosterone surged, instincts boiled, and the stag, now in peak maturity, saw every movement as a challenge. Still, Paul moved calmly, without hesitation. He stepped into the enclosure, shutting the gate behind him. To him, this was just another morning. To the stag, it was the moment to assert dominance, to prove strength. The air felt charged. The deer lowered its head, antlers gleaming, muscles coiled like springs. Paul, still believing he was in control, bent slightly as he poured out the feed. It was the last calm moment he would ever know. The line between trust and terror was about to snap. It happened in a blur. 1 second Paul was scattering feed, the next, the stag lunged. The antlers, sharp and sprawling like a crown of knives, drove straight into him. A sickening crack echoed through the paddock as Paul was lifted off his feet and slammed hard to the ground. The deer's weight bore down, its hooves thrashing, its muscles surging with raw, primal fury. Paul tried to push the animal away, but the beast was relentless. Again and again the antlers plunged, tearing into flesh. His cries split the quiet morning air, a sound no one on the property would ever forget. From the house, Mandy heard it. A sound that didn't belong. She ran, panic gripping her chest as she sprinted toward the enclosure. And then she saw it. Her husband, pinned beneath the animal he had raised. The stag's massive frame towering over him in a frenzy of violence. She screamed his name, rushing into the enclosure without hesitation. The stag turned its fury on her, goring her with brutal force. She felt the searing pain as antlers slashed across her body, but she fought to reach Paul, to drag him free. It was chaos, hooves pounding, antlers striking, screams filling the air. The trust Paul had placed in this creature had shattered in seconds. The animal wasn't a pet anymore. It was wild. It was lethal. And it was unstoppable. By the time help arrived, the damage was catastrophic. Paul lay lifeless in the dirt, his body torn apart by the very animal he had believed he could tame. The stag stood over the scene, sides heaving, nostrils flaring, as if daring anyone else to enter. The man who had raised him was gone. Blood soaked the earth as Mandy struggled to stand. The stag had driven her to the ground, its antlers slashing deep across her body. Every movement sent waves of pain ripping through her, but she refused to stop. Her husband lay motionless just feet away. She clawed at the dirt, gasping for breath, fighting against the dizziness that threatened to consume her. The stag circled, stomping, its wild eyes locked on her. For a moment, she thought this was the end, that she too would die in the place they had once called home. But sheer survival instinct took hold. Mandy dragged herself out of the enclosure, inch by inch, bleeding heavily, every second feeling like eternity. Somehow, she slipped through the gate before the stag charged again. Behind her, the enraged animal battered the fence, antlers crashing against wood, desperate to finish what it had started. Neighbors, hearing the screams, rushed to the scene. They found Mandy collapsed, her body ripped and broken, whispering Paul's name. Her injuries were catastrophic: deep punctures, shattered ribs, blood pouring from wounds carved by the animal they had raised with love. Emergency responders arrived within minutes, racing her to the hospital in critical condition. Doctors worked frantically through the night, stitching, transfusing, fighting to keep her alive. Against impossible odds, she survived. But Mandy's survival came at the greatest cost. The man she had built her life with was gone, and the scars she carried were not just on her body, but on her soul. The call came quickly. The animal had to be destroyed. Police and wildlife officers arrived at the Macdonald property to a scene that looked like a battlefield. Blood in the dirt, broken fence posts, the guttural roars of the stag echoing from its pen. It paced violently, nostrils flaring, antlers splintered with fresh blood. The same animal Paul once bottle-fed as a fawn now stood as his killer. Neighbors stood silently at the property's edge, watching, some weeping, others in disbelief. For 2 years, the Macdonalds had treated the deer like family, feeding it daily, showing it off to friends, even calling it gentle. But now, it was a monster in their midst, and the decision was absolute. Armed officers raised their rifles. The stag thrashed against the enclosure, charging at the fence with terrifying force, each impact rattling the posts. The order was given. A crack split the air, then another. The stag collapsed, its massive frame crashing into the dirt. The pet was no more. But the silence that followed wasn't a relief. It was hollow. Killing the animal didn't bring Paul back, and it didn't erase the horror of what had happened. All it did was close the final chapter of a tragic bond between man and beast. A relationship born in love, ended in blood. News of Paul Macdonald's death ripped through the small rural community like wildfire. Word spread from neighbor to neighbor, from farmhouses to town pubs, until everyone knew. Paul had been killed by his own deer. For those who loved him, it felt impossible to process. Paul wasn't reckless. He wasn't a man who tempted fate. He was a devoted father, a quiet and hard-working husband, a man who cared deeply for the land and the animals he raised. And now, he was gone. Killed not by a stranger, not by some accident on the road, but by a creature he trusted every day. At the local store, conversations stopped mid-sentence when Paul's name was mentioned. People shook their heads in disbelief. Not Paul. Not him. Some whispered that they had always been uneasy about that deer, while others defended the family, insisting no one could have predicted such savagery. The local news crews descended on the quiet property. Cameras filmed from the roadside, capturing police tape strung across the paddock, and neighbors leaving flowers at the fence line. What was once a picture of rural serenity was now the backdrop of a horror story. For the Macdonald children, the shock was unbearable. They had grown up petting the deer, laughing as it followed them around the property like a dog. Now they had to live with the memory that the same animal had taken their father's life. The tragedy became more than a headline. It became a warning. People across Australia, and beyond, asked the same question. How could something so trusted, so familiar, turn so suddenly, so fatally? And in that question was the chilling realization. No matter how tame an animal seems, nature's instincts are always waiting, just beneath the surface. In the days that followed, wildlife authorities and deer behavior specialists stepped forward to explain what had happened. And their words painted a chilling picture. The stag that killed Paul Macdonald was in rut, the mating season, when male deer are driven by surging testosterone to fight, dominate, and defend territory at all costs. Even in the wild, stags have been known to gore each other to death. Their antlers are not just ornaments, they are weapons, capable of impaling and tearing flesh with brutal precision. To experts, Paul's death was not random. It was biology. The animal had not gone mad. It had simply acted on instincts sharpened over thousands of years of evolution. And therein lay the danger. Paul, like many who grow comfortable around large animals, may have underestimated just how quickly that instinct could ignite. Deer are not pets, one authority told reporters flatly. During rutting season, even the calmest male can become aggressive. No amount of familiarity makes you safe. It was a warning that resonated beyond Victoria. People across Australia who kept deer, emus, even camels and ostriches, were reminded that exotic or powerful animals, even ones raised by hand, are never truly domesticated. They live by instinct, not sentiment. Paul Macdonald had treated the stag like part of the family. But in the end, when the hormones surged and the instincts took over, that deer saw him not as a caretaker, but as a rival. And in a brutal instant, the balance between man and beast tipped, with fatal consequences. When Paul fell, the stag did not stop. It thrashed, charged, and drove its antlers again and again into his body. From the house, his wife, Mandy Macdonald, heard the commotion and ran to the enclosure. What she saw was beyond comprehension, her husband being torn apart by the very animal they had fed and cared for every single day. Without hesitation, she tried to intervene. Neighbors later said her screams echoed across the property. Armed with nothing but her bare hands, she rushed at the stag, desperate to pull it away. The deer turned on her. In seconds, the antlers that had just ripped through Paul's body slashed across hers. She was gored, thrown to the ground, trampled. The force of a rutting stag, hundreds of pounds of muscle and rage, slammed into her again and again. Somehow, through sheer survival instinct, Mandy crawled away, blood pouring from her wounds. A neighbor, drawn by the chaos, pulled her to safety and called emergency services. Mandy was airlifted to the hospital in critical condition. She had suffered severe lacerations and internal injuries but miraculously survived. But her survival carried a cruel burden. While she clung to life in a hospital bed, Paul lay dead in their yard. The man she had built a life with, killed before her eyes by the animal they had trusted. For Mandy, every scar on her body would become a permanent reminder of the morning when her family was shattered. The day the stag turned predator. When first responders arrived at the Macdonald property, they faced a scene that looked like something out of a nightmare. Paul lay lifeless in the yard, his body shredded by antlers and hooves. Nearby, Mandy had already been rushed away by air ambulance, clinging to life. And inside the enclosure, the stag still paced restlessly, its coat stained dark with blood. The animal that had once been a pet was now something else entirely. Authorities knew there was no question of leaving it alive. A rutting stag is unpredictable, and after killing its owner, it had crossed the line from dangerous to lethal. Police cordoned off the property. With rifles raised, they entered the enclosure. Witnesses described the deer as defiant, standing tall, antlers forward, as if daring them to come closer. It was the last stand of a beast driven by instincts no human bond could ever erase. Gunshots rang out. The stag collapsed to the ground. The danger was over. But so was the life of the animal Paul had raised from a young buck, fed daily, and treated like family. For the Macdonalds' neighbors, it was a grim sight. The death of a man and the destruction of the animal he had loved, within hours of each other. A tragic double ending to a story that never should have happened. The enclosure, once a symbol of novelty and pride, was now silent. Blood on the ground marked the spot where a pet became a killer, and where trust in a wild animal proved fatally misplaced. Paul Macdonald's death wasn't just a freak accident. It was a brutal reminder that even the most familiar animals can turn into predators when instincts awaken. Deer are not gentle forest ornaments. They are wild, territorial creatures armed with antlers sharp enough to gore and hooves strong enough to crush. During rutting season, Testosterone surges transform even a docile buck into an unpredictable threat. Paul believed his stag knew him. He fed it, spoke to it, and trusted it. But the truth is chilling. The bond he thought he had was one-sided. In the end, biology and instinct drowned out every shred of human care. What Paul saw as a pet, nature still saw as a wild animal. Wildlife experts warn this is exactly why keeping exotic or powerful animals, even those raised from youth, is a gamble with death. The enclosure that once made Paul feel in control became his graveyard. No amount of love, familiarity, or routine could erase the raw drive that surges when nature takes over. His tragedy stands as a warning. That trust, however well-intentioned, cost him his life. And the echoes of his final moments still haunt the community that watched a man be killed not by a predator in the wild, but by the animal he thought he knew best. The death of Paul Macdonald ripped through his quiet Australian town like a shockwave. Neighbors who had seen the stag grazing peacefully behind fences could not believe the same animal had turned into a killer. But nature doesn't negotiate. Instinct is older, stronger, and deadlier than any illusion of control. Paul's story isn't just about a man and his deer. It's about the razor-thin line humans walk when we blur the boundary between pet and predator. The antlers that gored him weren't malicious. They were primal, a surge of wild dominance in mating season. To the deer, Paul wasn't a friend or caretaker. He was simply another rival in its territory. His death is both tragic and haunting because it was preventable. Experts say rutting stags should never be approached. Yet Paul, out of routine, out of trust, stepped inside that enclosure one final time. The price was fatal. And so his legacy lingers not just as a cautionary tale, but as a brutal reminder. The wild will always remain wild. No matter how much we feed it, love it, or believe we've tamed it, nature waits, patient and merciless, for the moment to remind us who truly holds the power. Paul Macdonald's death is a chilling reminder of how quickly trust in a wild animal can turn into tragedy. A beloved pet became the instrument of his end. Thank you for watching this story. If it grips you, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss the next tale of humans crossing paths with the untamable. And coming up next, we'll dive into another shocking case where an everyday encounter spiraled into unthinkable horror. You won't want to miss it.